Well, good afternoon. I trust that you find our time together interesting, beneficial, and dare I say, enjoying. We have some very special guests with us today. First, I would like to introduce to you Mark Tooley, who in some regards is actually our host, who is helping us put on this presentation today.
Thank you, Dr. Middleton. I am president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., and editor of our magazine, Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And we're able to bring this program to you because of our campus outreach initiative started just last fall, in which we send scholars of political theology to Christian college campuses, including some seminaries. You might ask, what is political theology? Well, scholars can give you a better answer than I can, but typically I describe it as how the church has understood God's purposes for government. And our concern in terms of why we created this initiative is that in American Christianity, which is increasingly post-denominational, we have forgotten what the historic church has taught us about God's purposes for government, the Catholic perspective, the Protestant perspective, among Protestants, the great traditions, Anglican, Lutheran, Reformed, Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, etc. So hopefully, in sending these scholars out to Christian college campuses, we can uplift historic political theology and maybe launch the first baby steps in terms of restoring our appreciation for these great traditions. But I'm delighted that Eric Patterson is able to speak to you today from on political theology, of course, but in terms of national security, foreign policy, just war teaching, obviously always pertinent and relevant, but especially these days. So thank you for listening. And in terms of promoting my own organization, we are always looking for interns at our Washington, D.C. office. And one of our interns is sitting here among us, Hope Ralston. So if you have any questions about what it's like to work at the IRD, she will give you the straight scoop, positive or negative, but hopefully mostly positive. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Eric and Dr. Middleton.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Gordon Middleton. Today's topic we have entitled Just War Options After Russian Use of WMD in the Ukraine. When you read Vladimir Putin's manifesto-like 5,000-word article written in July of 2021, entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians, its frequently stated assertion that Ukrainians and Russians are one people is striking, especially so since upon being so publicly rejected by average Ukrainians taking up arms against his invasion, rather than welcoming him as a brother Slav, Putin has changed his tone from last year to Ukraine is an artificial construct of the West, and we will no longer permit it to exist. As the New York Times put it, Putin portrayed the war as a preemptive strike against Western aggression and a decisive battle to protect Russia's rightful imperial hold over the Europe's east. It is not difficult to conclude, as the Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institute has done so, that Putin is a true believer in Russian nationalism and the intersection of history and myth, both past and present, if there ever was one. It's worth quoting from the opening pages of When Prophecy Fails, Leon Festinger's account in 1956 of a Chicago-based group of so-called seekers as they waited for a promised alien ship to arrive and deliver them from a worldwide flood that was prophesied to occur. Quote, "Suppose an individual believes something with his whole heart. Suppose further that he has a commitment to his belief, that he has taken irrevocable actions because of it. Finally, suppose that he is presented with unequivocal and undeniable evidence that his belief is wrong. What will happen? Festinger concludes like this: the more you invest in a set of beliefs, the greater the sacrifice you'll make in the service of that conviction, the more resistant you will be to evidence that suggests that you are mistaken. You don't give up, you double down. This conclusion could have been written today about Vladimir Putin and his belief in the imperative for the restoration of the Russian Empire. We are here this afternoon to think about the unthinkable. When Vladimir Putin follows in Ukraine the Russian military doctrine of escalating to de-escalate and uses weapons of mass destruction, because he may not be able to defeat the Ukrainians, much less NATO otherwise, what do NATO and the Western democracies do? What options do they consider? Which options pass the just war criteria? This is more than academic. The operational launch of the Russian hypersonic missile into Ukraine earlier this month was already an escalation. The White House has stated we have no defense against it. Putin used it with a conventional warhead, but that same air-launched Kinzhal missile system is capable of carrying a tactical nuclear warhead. And tactical nuclear escalation is regularly practiced by the Russian military. This recent missile launch into the western Ukraine is considered by many analysts as a signal of Putin's willingness to use WMD in Ukraine, and makes our topic for today almost too real for comfort. We have with us today Dr. Eric Patterson, who is a well-known expert and much published author on just war, to help us consider just such possibilities. He received his PhD in political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, focusing on international relations, comparative politics, and religion in politics. His master's in international politics was from the University of Wales, and his BA and bachelor's in education from Evangel University in Springfield, Missouri, in biblical studies and music education, respectively. Dr. Patterson is going to come at this time with a short refresher on just war, and after that, I will get the discussion started with several possible options for him to evaluate in light of just war. And last, we have reserved time for question and answers from you, the students. And when we get to that point, if you'd please come up and cue yourself at this microphone up in front so we make sure we get your full question on the video, we'd appreciate that. At this time now, would you please help me welcome Dr. Patterson.
Dr. Middleton and others, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you here at Patrick Henry College today. And despite the really grim topic of the war that's going on in Ukraine, the good news is that Christians are well equipped to think about right and wrong when it comes to war, peace, and security. My thanks also, and you see on the screen a slide from Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, Mark Tooley, who represents that. I urge you, all of you who are interested in national security policy and foreign policy, this is the best resource on a daily basis for understanding a Christian framing for how to think about issues of war and peace. Well, again, as we discussed earlier, my role for the first few minutes is I'm going to take a little bit of time and walk us through classic Christian just war thinking. And then we'll get into this conversation to demonstrate that it really does apply at the tactical and at the strategic level, even when we're talking about the potential horrors of the employment of nuclear devices. Now, it's beyond our scope to go back in time and to think through the timelines in the 20th century of the friction between Russia and Ukraine. I mentioned a few of them on this slide, and certainly if we had more time, we could talk about them. And again, it's really beyond our time to talk about these things from the past 7 years, when Russia first transgressed across Ukraine's border, intervened in what we call the Donbas region, the intervention in Crimea, the constant cyber bullying and political bullying that's gone on towards Ukraine over the past almost 8 years now. But if we had more time, we would take those factors into consideration as we think about not just the last month, but that there's been essentially a state of war directed by Russia towards Ukraine for the last 8 years. But let's talk about the Christian framework for thinking about just war thinking. Now, as Mark said earlier, this is not a Catholic thing or a Protestant thing only. 99% of the world's Christians in their denominations espouse some form of just war thinking. So if your background is in Baptist theology or Wesleyan theology or Reformed theology, or almost all charismatic groups which come from one of those branches, or Lutheran, or Catholic, or Eastern Orthodox, so with the exception of a very small minority in Christendom of true Anabaptists, almost all traditions venerate the just war tradition. And historically, that has asked at least 3 questions. First, what are the ethics of going to war? In other words, of making the decision to employ force. And second, what are the ethics of how force is used? And then third, what are the ethics of building a robust, orderly, and enduring peace? Now let's pause for a moment. You might be thinking to yourself, I don't remember the verses in the Bible that lay all that stuff out. But just like most other things in life, the Bible lays a rich theological bedrock, and then we build from there the principles for living in social life, right? So it's better to think about this as just statecraft, just politics, than only narrowly focusing on interstate war. And I've put a few of those principles on the screen here. So for instance, the Bible has a lot to say about stewardship, right? Including teachings that the king should count the cost before activity, count the cost before building a tower. Well, of course, that suggests kings have to build towers for defense. It talks about kings listening to many counselors before making foreign policy decisions that might lead to war. The Bible is full also of a second type of theological principle that applies, and that's about vocation. We believe that there's a calling in society for every Christian, right? That's what you're taught here at Patrick Henry College. And among those vocations are those in public service. So governors, judges, magistrates, elected officials, prime ministers, and those in law enforcement and the military. Each of those is a noble calling to help promote and to secure justice. Now, the Bible has a lot to say also in terms of giving us examples of people doing that work. Moses, Joshua, Joseph, Daniel, Nehemiah, and others. And in the New Testament, none of our New Testament leaders, Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, Peter, none of them repudiate the importance of those who serve in public life. Remember, John the Baptist told the centurions not to drop their swords, but to not harass the poor. Jesus said that the person with the most faith that he met was a Roman centurion. The first Gentile convert was another Roman centurion. Paul regularly greets members of Caesar's household, which means people in the administrative work around the Roman emperor. He greets Zenas the lawyer and others. So the Bible is full of these little moments where we see that there are people who are called into public service vocations, and some of those have to do with the business of law enforcement and war. Another biblical principle that we see is the principle of political order. Christians believe that the Lord set up natural institutions in society. The church, the family, government, right? These are natural institutions that are God-ordained, both in the Old and in the New Testament eras. They matter. And so they have a role to play, and we have teaching on them, such as Romans 13, that tells us that government is there for our good. It provides defense, it provides justice, and by the way, we're supposed to pay our taxes, right? Now I could go on, But an underlying principle so often in the Bible, of course, as Jesus reminds us, is the principle of love. The question often is, how do I love my neighbor in the vocations to which I'm called? And so a lot of times people say, well, yeah, I'm supposed to love the guy or gal next to me. I'm supposed to turn the other cheek in individual relationships. Maybe they get angry with me. I'm trying to reflect the love of Christ. But in your vocational roles, how do you demonstrate love for neighbor? How do you demonstrate love for neighbor as a parent with a disobedient small child? Well, we use some sort of force to discipline them and to call them into correction, loving correction. If we're called to law enforcement, how do we demonstrate love for our community and neighbor? Well, it's often through the implementation of force to protect the vulnerable from criminals. And the same is true for elected leaders, and it's true for people in the military as well. And that's a big difference. There's a difference between force, which is restrained and lawful and under authority, as opposed to violence. Violence is unrestrained. It's unlawful. It's motivated by revenge and by hate. There's a difference there. Well, that takes us to these three questions. When is it moral to go to war? And the classic just war framing of this from Augustine and from Aquinas is this. Legitimate political authorities can make the decision to employ force when acting on a just cause with right intention. So governments can act on a just cause. What's a just cause? Augustine says, righting a past wrong, preventing future wrongs, punishing wrongdoers. So justice and self-defense. And right intention. And this is something that we as Christians play a big role in. We're not just saying, well, that the end justifies the means. Whether it's God talking to Samuel in the Old Testament that God looks on the heart, not on the outward appearance, or Jesus reminding us that the birthplace of sin is inside of us, not externally. Motivations, intentions matter. So what's a good motivation for going to war? Protection, neighbor love, defense of the community, love of country. Those are different than revenge, vengeance, hatred, greed, or lust. Now, we've added over time some prudential criteria that wise leaders take into account. Is there a likelihood that we'll be successful? Is going to war proportionate to the grievance and to our objectives? And have all reasonable efforts been made at the other elements of resolving conflict? Most of you are strategic intelligence or political science majors, so you know the four elements of national power: diplomacy, information, military, and economics. And if you think about all of those realms, the wise diplomat is thinking to themselves, the wise leader is thinking, okay, what's the right one to advance our objectives and create peace? And at times, the right one, you get to that last resort moment, the right thing is the use of the military instrument. Now, when the decision is made to go to war, then there are criteria for how war is fought. And again, you can see that these are really stewardship and limiting, the restraining principles. The first is military necessity. It is important to actually to fight in a way with an eye towards victory on this battlefield at this time, to protect our troops and to win. But we restrain that through proportionality, meaning that the tactics we use, the weapons we use here and now, are proportionate to the threat. So for instance, you wouldn't drop a nuclear bomb on a sniper who's shooting at you, right? That's ridiculous. It's disproportionate. And the principle of discrimination or distinction, which distinguishes non-combatants, civilians, private property, etc., from legitimate military objects of attack, such as the enemy bunkers, enemy columns, armor, aircraft, etc. Well, we always want to keep an eye towards the ethics of late conflict and post-conflict. How do we bring a conflict to an enduring, secure peace? And there's three principles here. The first one is order, and this is much harder to attain than most people realize. In places like Sudan and Afghanistan, places that have endemic insecurity, it is very difficult to achieve a basic order. And order is made up of three parts: One is just basic services and governance. Can a government provide a basic level of services and governance within its borders? Second, does the government have to worry about internal threats like insurgents or insurrectionists or criminal cartels? And third, is that country stable on its borders, or is it facing imminent threat from outside? You think about Afghanistan, it never met those conditions of order over the past 20 years. You think about Ukraine today, what might a new security arrangement look like? Somehow it has to have a secure eastern border. It has been insecure for the past decade. Now, at the end of some wars, we can take steps towards justice, holding some people accountable for wrong, restitution or restoration to victims. We can talk about that if you like later. And over time, a goal should be, although it's very hard to put into practice, conciliation, which is coming to terms with the past in a way that we can imagine former adversaries as at least inhabiting the same space in a future peace. I'm not talking about kumbaya or rainbows and unicorns and cotton candy and everybody gets along. I'm talking about the hard work of changing the security dynamics so that former adversaries can at least live side by side in some sort of new consensus about peace and security. Well, that's a framework for thinking about issues of war and peace from a Christian perspective. And it's not just historic battles, what happened in the US Civil War, what happened in the American War for Independence, but it applies to the issues of today, and it applies to the very difficult issues that we're going to talk about, including the potential for deadly weapons of mass destruction. So, Professor Middleton, over to you. Thank you.
I would like to kick off the beginning of this next section by introducing some potential options that some level of plausibility, heads of NATO as well as our own president, in such circumstances we've sort of set up here for our scenario in this discussion, very well might consider. Mm-hmm. And we'll go through them. I encourage the students to be thinking of your favorite scenario that you might like to suggest in similar fashion when we get to the Q&A. The first one, perhaps in some ways the preferred option of many of us, would be no response. Mm-hmm. And implicit in that, to what extent in the just war thinking is there an imperative for action? I think most often we think of it as a permissive kind of criteria. Is there any implication of the necessity of defending the little guy, in a sense, in this situation?
Yeah, well, the just war tradition doesn't say that you have to get involved in all fights, all the time, everywhere. Not even the powerful United States has that responsibility. What we would expect is that we would honor our word and our commitments. So for instance, if we were bound by a treaty to come to the aid of another country, it would be dishonorable. But by no means does that mean that any government, and in this case we're talking about the United States, has to respond with military force at all times in all places to prop up the little guy. Now I will say one other thing. There are lots of things that can be done other than a full-scale invasion. And that range of possibilities goes everything from providing weapons so that the Ukrainians can defend themselves, by the way, which we didn't really do until very recently. We did not provide them with what they were asking for in the past. And second, there's a lot of non-military options that countries are doing. An example of this is that 4 million Ukrainians have fled the country, by the latest counts, I believe, and that European countries are hosting them. And countries like the United States can provide a lot of the humanitarian aid needed for those refugees. So it's not simply that it's all or nothing, war or peace. There's a whole range of options between do nothing and do something.
Okay. Along the lines of economic kinds, one of those other instruments of national power, something that I think of as sort of the George Weigel option. He recently wrote a piece in Catholic Review essentially suggesting that some of the money and funds recouped via some of the economic sanctions could in fact be used to help replenish some of the military supplies of the Ukrainians, as well as for broad economic restoration and rebuilding of the country, already which some estimates reach $100 billion to do something like that. And interestingly, at least to me, he also suggested that some of those funds could be used to essentially provide some compensation to the families who have lost sons, fathers, daughters in this conflict on both the Ukrainian side and on the Russian side. It's also interesting that he pointed to in that article Putin's wealth is estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 200 billion,
Right.
with much of that located outside of the country, so it might be accessible, as well as the group of Russian oligarchs with somewhere on the order of $800 billion that potentially would be touchable. How would you react to his thoughts in that regard?
Yeah. So as I said in the presentation, and I talk about at length in my book, Ending Wars Well, when you think about post-conflict justice, we think about aggressors and we think about victims. We think about punishment on the one hand and we think about restitution on the other. And in the past, the way that we did punishment was we punished a country. And so we would impose sanctions after the fact on the country often, and the whole country would have to pay, and the elites would get off scot-free, really. And a good example of this was after the 1991 invasion of Kuwait, in which the world community pushed Saddam Hussein's Iraq out of Kuwait. We then sanctioned Iraq with a program that was notoriously corrupt. By the way, those payments went on starting in 1992 or 1993 until February of 2022, last month. The payments went on for 30 years from Iraq to Kuwait. But throughout the 90s, what those payments did was the elites lived in the pleasure palaces of Iraq. I've been in those palaces. They lived an opulent life in harems, basically, whereas the common Iraqi was hit by these sanctions. So what you want to do is these targeted sanctions, targeted punishment of leaders like Putin, like the oligarchs, et cetera, not the entirety of the country. And if you can use those monies to do some restitution, you'll never bring people back, right? You'll never bring back the battle dead, but you can rebuild infrastructure, you can rebuild parts of the economy, and if appropriate, you can take some of the leaders and perhaps, if appropriate, I'm not sure it is yet, do Nuremberg-style war crimes trials or something for a few senior leaders. Let me say something that's less satisfying, though. If there was a popular uprising in Russia and Putin was looking like he was going to crack down on his own people, maybe detonate a nuclear device in Ukraine, the best option might be to let him go into secluded isolation somewhere with his billions, send him to a chalet in the Swiss Alps and lock him down in luxury for the rest of his life. We usually don't think that way, but we used to think that way. It was usually there would be an off-ramp for dictators. They could take some of their money, go hide in their castle, and we'd lock up, it would be splendid isolation until they died, like Idi Amin and others. We haven't done that so much since the 1990s. I'm not sure it'll work for Putin, but it's worth remembering that's an off-ramp for some dictators.
Great. As many of us are aware, the Russians have made no secret that they have sent some of their special forces, even mercenaries, into Ukraine, trying to hunt both Ukrainian leadership in general and particularly President Zelensky. It is certainly possible that NATO might make a decision to provide logistics and intel kinds of support to some sort of Ukrainian response to that that might attempt to target Putin and some of his leadership back in kind. That wouldn't necessarily be NATO directly with hands on the weapons, but providing some of that infrastructure support. What would be your reaction to that?
Yeah. So I want to say something about the mercenaries and then say something about, a decapitation of a leader. So when it comes to the mercenaries, typically mercenaries are not seen, especially unmarked mercenaries, these so-called little green men, the Wagner group, people are outside of the military chain of command and outside of uniform. They're seen as illegitimate under the laws of armed conflict, unless there's a very, very clear relationship between them and a government. And the reason comes back to these just war criteria about authority and order. When you have people who are outside of uniform, whether they're criminals or terrorists or mercenaries operating outside of a military uniform, they're eroding the very basis for dueling belligerents that are operating under the legitimate authority of a political entity. So they're as bad as pirates. They're as bad as a criminal cartel because they're operating outside of the bounds of legitimacy. And so this is a very illegitimate thing if the Russians are really doing this. And I actually have no doubt that they would play these games because they sent unmarked people outside of regular military uniforms in previous conflicts. Second, there's generally a proscription, in other words, a prohibition against targeting political leaders. So if it's true that there are assassins trying to go after Zelensky, that is an illegitimate activity under the laws of armed conflict. And you can see how this has its root in the idea that political authorities have a role to play in providing justice and order. And it's an attack on the basic framework of international life, and therefore it's been seen as illegitimate really throughout the last several centuries to attack the head of state or to attack the head of government because they represent the processes of political and order and justice in the country. So if this is true, it's really an anathema. Now, if it's true that the Russians are going after Zelensky, it would not make it right necessarily for the West to help Zelensky to go after Vladimir Putin with a decapitation strike. It's usually pretty impractical to take out the head of another country in most cases. I think there's a couple of exceptions, but that causes its own level of chaos. And so you really have to think through, in a sense, Putin is a legitimate military target. He's directing this war personally, but does chopping the head off of that create chaos in Russia that is actually even worse? It's usually not a good idea to take out leaders like that. What do you think? You've been watching these things for a long time.
To what extent would you see differences between that or not with the Bonhoeffer cooperation with the group that was trying to take Hitler out during World War II?
Yeah. So Bonhoeffer was a German patriot, and the attempts that were made, the failed attempts on Hitler's life, including the plot that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was involved with, were Germans trying to stop their own illegitimate leader, this dictatorial threat to world peace, and the guy who was causing the death in the Holocaust of millions of people. That is a different thing than a decapitation strike from the other side. I would say that there are rare cases where I've thought that a decapitation strike is legitimate, especially when there's a government infrastructure that would work. North Korea might be an example. Saddam Hussein was uniquely vile, and he'd attacked 3 of his neighbors. He might have made sense. There was plenty of infrastructure there that could have carried on. Of course, we dismantled that. That's a different conversation. But I think those cases are actually pretty rare.
Okay. If you have a question, if you would please go ahead and queue up at the microphone. I'd appreciate that. I only have so many questions on my list here, and we really do want to get to some of your questions. So if you could assist with it, that would be great. I alluded in my opening remarks to the potential for NATO responding in kind to a weapons of mass destruction use by Putin and the Russian forces. This has been, depending on which time you listen, our own president has used very familiar or very similar language saying, well, yes, we would respond in kind. Trying to be gracious, I'll say it's not entirely clear whether he meant either intent or specific weapons or location or exactly what the intention was there. But part of this becomes problematic that the assumption is likely Putin would use this against what in the Cold War we called counter-population target, to try to break the will of the people. What would be your reaction if NATO were to consider that kind of a response in kind, at least with weapon, even if we went against military targets, even if that's not what their initial attack was against?
Yeah. You know, when it comes to nuclear devices, and this entire area is very complicated, I think, when it comes to Ukraine. Because first, there are nuclear reactors. You may recall in the first weeks of the war, there was a concern that the Russians seemed to be attacking the nuclear reactors. So one scenario is that Russia despoils Ukraine in some way and then pulls out. And one of those ways is just dismantle or blow up one of these nuclear reactors and cause a localized reactor meltdown. It's kind of a dirty bomb scenario. And a second would be to use a tactical nuclear device, which is a localized small yield device, but can be very, very destructive, especially against a population.
Yes.
And I mention these for you because so often we in America, the way we think about a nuclear weapon is we think about a high kiloton, massive, society-destroying weapon. That's especially for people of kind of my generation, that's what we think about, the end of the world. And it's anathema. That's not the way the Russians think about these things. The way the Russians think about these things is the same way that they think about the way that they defeated Hitler and the way that they defeated Napoleon. And that's that they have strategic depth. And so, you know, if you put a little tiny nuclear device on a Ukrainian city, especially in western Ukraine like Lviv, and then you pull out, what you've done is you just smashed them and you've left all of this ruin, but you just pull way back into Russia and you've made your point. And I mean, is NATO, what is NATO going to do about that? So I think that we miss that there's the Russians, like you said in your remarks, they practice contingency operations that include battlefield nuclear devices. So first of all, laying that groundwork, we should all realize that this is actually a real thing. This is not this is a scenario that actually could happen. I actually think it's most likely not to try to extend the battlefield west, but in despoilment. Almost
to draw a line.
Just to draw a line, to say if we can't own Ukraine, we're going to make it a minefield like the DMZ between South and North Korea. You know, this is what we're going to do. We're pulling out. We're going to leave rubble and destruction in our wake. Whether they use a nuclear device, by the way, I think that's what they're going to do. Would the West respond in kind? I know that's at the basis of the question. And I find it very hard to imagine that the West would respond in kind. I think that the West, there's such a nuclear taboo in the West that unless a nuclear device was used on a NATO ally, that the West wouldn't use a nuclear weapon of any kind, even a tactical one.
Does the just war speak to that in any dimension?
Sure. So you might be surprised to know that all the way back to the 1950s and 60s that Paul Ramsey and others, great just war thinkers, Christian just war thinkers, were thinking about nuclear devices and their use. And where most just war thinkers who think that atomic or nuclear devices can be used, like me, agree is that they shouldn't be used counter-population, which means you would never deliberately target a city to hit the city and to kill as many people as possible. That would be illegitimate. But that there may be uses, first for deterrence purposes, to keep an enemy from attacking in the first place. That's a legitimate reason to build nuclear technology. And second, that under certain conditions, to attack another country's forces, counter-force operations, that nuclear weapons can be used. And I think that there's a variety of specific scenarios that way. By the way, it's worth noting that this is really not a jus in bello thing. This is really about jus ad bellum, the decision to go to war and leadership. We really want thoughtful strategic leaders, and that's why you guys are all here at Patrick Henry in the Strategic Intelligence Program. We want thoughtful, moral, deep-thinking leaders who are going to be the decision-making men and women in those moments about making those big strategic calls. It's not saying, oh, we're going to send, a few more 1,000 rifles out the door. It's, oh, the buck stops here about making the big decision. So I applaud the work.
Just one comment, and I see we have a couple of student questions as well. Great. I want the first one come on up to the mic. It's interesting to note that fair amount of discussion in some of the news media about Russia's hyperbaric weapons, the so-called vacuum air-fuel mixture sort of weapons that in raw explosive power approach or maybe even are equivalent to the bottom rung of some of the tactical nuclear weapons as you were describing. So from a non-political standpoint, they've already approached that range of destructiveness. First question, please.
Certainly. So firstly, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. I think this has been a really great talk. I've really enjoyed the lecture so far. I just had a question about applying just war thinking, particularly to the conflict in Ukraine, in perhaps a less conventional way, by targeting something like the power base of Russia's society and political infrastructure. In an article that Colonel Middleton provided to us, you mentioned how both Russia's religious orthodoxy has been a major source of power for their administration, and also how it's perhaps not that clear-cut in Ukraine. In the hypothetical situation where a tactical nuclear device is detonated in Ukraine, to what extent can you use something such as misinformation or even just intentional undermining of that religious or political social base to counteract that sort of idea, since it's not necessarily as clear-cut as just targeting your missile strikes against military targets as opposed to civilian ones?
Sure. So let me comment on two separate parts of your question. And the first thing is just about, I want to say something about the religious dimension of this conflict because it really is fascinating. And then separately talk about, really we're talking about the second element of national power here, which is all of the possibilities about wide-ranging information operations, from kind of cyber attack to misinformation to ruse de guerre, et cetera. So first, on the religious side, this really is interesting because Ukraine, in a sense, I mean, have you stopped to ask yourself, what is it about little Ukraine? Its population is just a quarter, right, of Russia's, something like that, a third of Russia's. It doesn't have huge amounts of oil or diamonds or something, although it is an important wheat supplier. I mean, what is it about Ukraine that drives Vladimir Putin nuts? And it most likely is that Ukraine is on his border as a testimony to a different model of political development over the past 20 years. And that political development is one that embraces religious liberty and the other things we'd consider the First Amendment freedoms. And it's best understood that this is the only country in the region that has religious denominationalism. In other words, robust national churches, Catholic, Russian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, evangelicals, a president who's of Jewish extraction. I mean, no other country in that part of the world has this, and that's a foundation for also speech, press, conscience, private property, etc. All outside of government control. In contrast to Putin's Russia, where government is invading every sector, higher education, media, etc. You know, Russia's not a highly religious society. Ukrainians are 3 times more likely to go to church on Sunday than their Russian counterparts. But as Putin, over the past 20 years, has tried to develop a Russian ethos, a 21st century Russian nationalism, a part of that is a historical, cultural, spiritual, religious dimension in the Orthodox Church, which has justified the war in Syria as a holy war and justified this invasion with an infamous March 6 remarks by Bishop Kirill. I say all that to say that I can't speak to Putin's faith. I've written about this in Providence and other places. We don't know about his personal faith, but he's created a Russian nationalism that's hierarchical and authoritarian and has an orthodoxy component that sees Ukraine as a threat to his model on his back door. Now, all of that being said, what about information operations? And certainly, when you think about all of the ways for there to be struggle or competition, it is perfectly legitimate for the Ukrainians to fight back, in a sense, in all of those dimensions. Hacking. By the way, the Russians have been doing all of this to Ukraine nonstop since at least 2013, if not longer. So it's appropriate for Ukraine, and it's appropriate for external actors to be displaying the truth against Russian censors, to be broadcasting to the Russian people, hey, look at what this aggression really looks like. You need to know the truth of this, as well as the other more clandestine types of activities, such as trying to dismantle internally Russian weapon systems. So all of that, I think, is good to go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Next.
I guess a question that I had is, how do you apply classical just war thinking to the cyber realm, where attribution is difficult, and also, like, how do you react to cyber crimes? Should you use conventional warfare tactics to go after people who destroy your infrastructure, or should you respond with not cyber crime, but should you respond exclusively through the cyber realm?
Do you want to say something about this?
We had a team of our students, in fact, last Friday and Saturday, participate in a competition sponsored by the Atlantic Council that in many regards was trying to come to grips with exactly that kind of question. Scenario based in the Middle East, based on some water supply systems going down, actually putting some people's lives at risk. And our team's role was to come up with recommended strategies to the National Security Council on how to respond. And I think the fundamental approach that we took, and then in fact was encouraged, was cyber response to cyber attack is limited. That even as this administration has suggested, that in advance we should not set aside or take any options off of the table of those 4 instruments of national power. And a strategy that the U.S. has long endorsed is this whole issue of strategic ambiguity, so that if you're going to attack us, you can't necessarily know ahead of time what domain or the level of response that the United States is going to take to that. The idea being that that is much more of a strategy to deter the original attack to begin with, rather than saying, oh, it's just going to be tit for tat. I'm curious, from a just war theory, as long as that stays proportional, which in some ways is a judgment call, any comments or reactions to that kind of approach?
Yeah. So a couple things about cyber. First, the just war principles do apply here, although people sometimes say, well, if it's not a sword or a gun, does it apply? But remember that the first duty of government is to protect the lives, livelihoods, and way of life of its citizenry. The lives, livelihoods, and way of life. And so an attack on the lives, livelihood, and way of life, a cyber attack, an EMP, etc., that is designed to harm the lives, the livelihoods, wiping out bank accounts, the way of life, hitting a water source, polluting water, knocking out the electrical grid. Those are attacks that can kill citizens. And so just because they happen online doesn't mean that they're not violent. So first, we want to know, we want to keep legitimate authorities, governments need to have a robust cyber defense and cyber response capability. And we want that to not only be out in the private sector, we want government to be investing in that to protect and defend our own, to be pushing back all the time, and to be ready to respond in that domain. And second, it reminds us that hackers and nefarious criminal groups that are outside, that are attacking other governments or business infrastructure, that they are terrorists. They are a threat because they are causing lawlessness and disorder. And so a second principle is that governments should be in active postures, again, trying to stop, trying to neutralize, trying to kill, in a sense, groups that are attacking, that are non-state actors in that domain. And then the third part of this is recognizing that in this domain, that a cyber attack, again, that attacks the lives and livelihoods of our own citizens, that's one element of power, and the appropriate response may be a very physical or kinetic response that wipes out the communications ability of that power, wipes out their technology, that kills some of those technicians, frankly, by a kinetic or a physical attack on them. We sometimes pretend that these cyber attacks are not real. Life and death. Listen, if you have family members in the hospital on life support and a cyber attack takes out the power and they die, those are unarmed. Those are civilians attacked by an outside power. That's not just a cyber attack; it's an act of war.
We could have our last student question.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Patterson. I was wondering, because you briefly discussed the issue of genocide in your just war portion, what you believe, if you believe that just war theory reveals a moral obligation for the United States to have a stronger response to the genocide of the Uyghur Muslims from the CCP, and if the United States, if just war theory does demand some kind of stronger response from the United States, what that kind of response would even look like.
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting this week, I know you're asking about the Uyghurs, but it's interesting that this week that the U.S. administration has finally made a determination about the Rohingya, which are a Muslim minority, which is a pretty fascinating story. We sometimes hear about them in the news. You know, this is, if you look at Burma, the country, or Myanmar where this has happened, this is a very diverse country. It has over 40 population or ethnic groups in the society. None of them, it's not a country with 75% of one and then a bunch of little minorities. It's kind of, 30% of this and 20% of that and 18% of this and lots of small minority groups that are, populations of 1.2 million up to 5 million. Starting in around 2016, 2017, the Burmese military essentially pushed out 1.2 to 1.4 of the 1.7 million Rohingya living in their country. I mean, think about that number. In the United States, it would be something like our military pushing out 25 million people across the border into Mexico. I mean, it's a really stunning number. And the U.S. government has finally said, okay, we think that this is a case of genocide, just earlier this week. Well, if that's the case, under the Genocide Convention, we've made a promise, we've made a commitment to act. And so in any time that there's an actual genocide and we make that determination, our authorities are supposed to do the work. That's the principle of authority. And the just cause is the principle that we've made a commitment to intervene at some point when this is going on. And the intention, of course, is to protect human life and property and to not let this lawlessness get worse and worse and worse. So it's perfectly appropriate in any of these cases. I will say this, that as I've written many times, including in Providence, the Uyghur situation is terrible. And clearly they are in concentration camps, work camps. I would say that we would need a determination that the purpose was, remember, genocide is the extinction, the purposeful extinction of an ethnic group. And that's a little different than crimes against humanity, against ethnic cleansing, et cetera. You'd need that type of determination for there to be that level of action. But I would certainly say the Uyghurs, plus Hong Kong, plus the repression of Christian Falun Gong, plus the threats against Taiwan. China is belligerent on the world stage. And we should just recognize that we are in a cold war with them that is violent and that we should be trying to block them on every corner. And frankly, what we need on the Uyghur situation is not just leadership from the United States. Here's what's really disheartening. Muslim majority countries are not taking the lead in calling this out. They are kowtowing to the Chinese behind closed doors. Indonesia was the one country that really pushed China, and then they were stiff-armed and they backed off. Muslim majority countries need to take the lead alongside the West in calling out China when it comes to the Uyghurs in calling out Burma when it comes to the Rohingya. The best friend that victims have around the world is usually the US and our allies. But the simple fact of the matter is it's not only our responsibility, but it's the responsibility of others as well. Thanks.
I've recently been reading the book by Malcolm Gladwell entitled The Bomber Mafia, coming from an previous Air Force career that was certainly of interest. In that book, he quotes General Curtis LeMay to the effect that when LeMay launched the B-29 strikes, firebomb strikes on Tokyo, that his comment was, if this raid works the way I think it will, we can shorten the war. And essentially was making the argument that in order to keep war as short as possible, it needs to be as ferocious and intense to try to get to the end point as quickly as you can. The idea being that overall that minimizes the actual death, loss of property, damage, etc. Gladwell also then goes on to quote a Japanese historian who told him no firebombs and no atomic bombs, and the Japanese don't surrender. And if they don't surrender, the Soviets invade, and eventually the Americans would invade in response to that. Japan gets carved up, just as Germany and the Korean Peninsula eventually were. Another historian takes it another step further by saying that one of the real accomplishments that General MacArthur made was that because the surrender happened in August, he was able to bring his forces in quickly enough before winter really set in, and brought in massive amounts of food because the handwriting was on the wall that the Japanese were literally on the point of starving to death. And that was actually one of his successes that actually went directly back to LeMay's comment about we've got to get this over quickly. I guess the question is, some might argue that in a longer view, a just war calculation, if Putin is in fact correct that the NATO and US would be extremely reluctant to actually respond in kind with a nuclear weapon, that and not match his level of violence, that perhaps the just war notions might actually support his escalate to de-escalate strategy. Right. How do you respond to that?
Yeah. Well, on the last point, because Putin's invasion is illegitimate from the beginning, it wouldn't be moral for him to escalate to get the war done quicker, because the entire enterprise is immoral and illegitimate. This was an unprovoked attack, and there were other ways to get a better security architecture that Russia would feel more confident with than bombing hospitals and schools, which is what he's doing in Ukraine. Now, jumping to the larger issue, the social science literature that studies wars is actually pretty clear on this, and that is that it's that you can get to peace quicker if there's aggressive fighting that's more robust, one side loses quickly, versus kind of slow ramping it up over time incrementally, which over time decreases trust and just disintegrates law, order, and infrastructure. Now, I do want to pick up on a point you're making about the end of World War II that's important, since we're talking about nuclear weapons. First, there is a difference between these kinds of strategic bombings to end the war, whether it's fire bombings or the use of atomic weapons in Japan, or the firebombing of Dresden and some cities in Germany. Look at the motivations. So if the motivation is we have to smash them and get this done quickly, and then as Abraham Lincoln said, and then we're going to let them up easy after we win, that's an important model. If the intention is we want to end this war as quickly as possible, we want to save as many of the lives of our own troops and families as possible, we don't want this to linger, that's different than bombing them because we hate them. We want vengeance on them. And clearly when you look at some of the things that Winston Churchill had to say, and by the way, he's a hero to me in many ways, but you see some of his language about bombing German citizens and German cities. And clearly there was a vindictiveness or a vengeance in his approach to bombing those cities during World War II. By the way, the scholars like Richard Frank and others suggest that, and Harry Truman's, his consultants at the time believed it would save at least 1 million lives to bring the war to a quick termination like we did in August of 1945. I think that's undisputed. There's a new book by one of our Providence editors, Mark Levicki, that'll come out later next year that explores the just war dimensions of dropping atomic bombs and why it was a just and legitimate thing to do in that case. It's a great book that you'll want to read. But the point is, if you're in this piece, trying to move briskly with that in mind, and you can really see intentions when the war is won, right? Because MacArthur wanted to establish order that was in the U.S. interest, but also the interest of the Japanese people. He brought the food and supplies. He kept the monarchy, but he instituted the Tokyo trials. I mean, there was a lot of great statesmanship to create a new post-war secure infrastructure that has kept the peace there to this day. That's a remarkable achievement.
Great. Well, Dr. Patterson, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.
Appreciate your comments, your remark, your very mature approach on this challenging subject. And I hope that for all of us, today is actually the last time we end up talking about the use of nuclear weapons in the Ukraine. Thank you very much.